Talking about this sort of manufacturing consent for war and this sort of propaganda push to put China, Russia, these are our enemies, and we have to justify why we are raising military budgets, etc. How effective is this manufacturing consent when it comes to China? Because, as you said, with Russia, there is a proximity thing. So Russia's pretty close to Europe. You can say, oh, you're going to get invaded. And then the use of Ukraine is this, well, we have to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. Obviously, they're trying to do that with Taiwan, which is, a completely ridiculous thing considering how far it is away, how small Taiwan is, the history of Taiwan and China, the one China policy. But is it actually working in Europe? Like, so many of these things that you just mentioned seem very obvious to us as an anti-imperialist podcast. But how is it working on the politicians in Europe, on the public in Europe? Can you give us a breakdown on how effective do you think it is?
Well, I think it's important to make that difference between Russia and China also in regard to the public debate and the political debate. Russia has been very much, of course, at the center of much of the talk on defense for obvious reasons, not just geographic proximity, but also and mainly because of the war in Ukraine. Now, there's a contradiction in their narrative. One day, Russia is on the brink of collapse, so we should give more weapons to Ukraine so they can kick out Russia militarily from their territory. And the next day, Russia is so strong as it might send tanks to Brussels and Paris. So there's or the UK if you would listen to the Secretary General of NATO. So there's obviously a contradiction. Both cannot be true on the same day. Now, it is clear that the question of security and peace on the European continent is a real one. And we need to look at, okay, so how do you create that? And we need to look at the lessons from history. The idea of we need to militarize massively and then we'll have security, that doesn't work. Peace doesn't come through arms. That doesn't mean like we want to abolish the army or something. It's not about that. It's about you need this dynamic of, okay, how can my interests, my security interests be guaranteed and how can yours be guaranteed? And this is basically what at the time of the Cold War was the Helsinki process. The Helsinki process was like, okay, started in the 70s. Countries from the Eastern Bloc, the bloc, let's say, led by the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc, so the Western European countries, United States, coming together and saying, okay, we need to have a conversation about security in Europe and say, okay, my security is indivisible. So I will only be safe if you also feel safe, because otherwise, intuitively it could make sense to say, I need more weapons, so I will be safer. I will guarantee security. The thing is, if I buy more weapons or produce more weapons, the other side will do that as well. If the other side does it, I need to buy more weapons, produce more weapons, and so on and so on. This is the security paradox, basically, where you do something to increase your security, but you basically decrease your security. So we need to get into that mindset to say, okay, how can we create an organization or a system of collective security like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which came out of the Helsinki process and which was an interesting initiative, but today has a budget, an annual budget that is, I think, lower than the cost of an F-22 fighter jet. So just to give you an idea of how much we don't invest in that kind of collective security. But that's a debate you need to have. You need to have a debate on, okay, what's the priorities? How do you create peace? How do you create security? In regard to China, I would say that the discussion on China is different economically. So there was some talk, the United States pushed us as European countries very much to, either decouple from China completely. So they pushed a number of EU companies to stop their trade with China or to limit their trade with China. So this is ongoing, but the talk is more about de-risk now. To say we shouldn't be too dependent on China. Now, diversifying trade relations as such is a strategy that makes perfect sense for any country, also for European countries, obviously. But at the same time, we also need to accept that there's an interdependency with China. between European countries and China, there's an interdependency. There's some things that China needs from Europe or gets from Europe, and vice versa. So this is also something that can create a more cooperative, I would say, environment, rather than say, no, we need a new Cold War. In regard to Taiwan, I would say that Taiwan for the moment is not very central to, at least in the public debate. And I would argue that the history, the situation, even the resolutions from the United Nations on this and so on are not widely known right now. It would, of course, in case the crisis escalates or something happens or whatever, then it would, of course, and then I'm guessing it will be framed as sometimes this is done already in parliament resolutions as a battle for freedom. So why would you get involved on the other side of the world, basically? Well, it's a battle. Then you need to invent or create some kind of moral justification for this. But I think much of the militarization drive today in Europe is justified, is explained through Russia, through the war in Ukraine, and then a real or perceived threat or threats from Russia towards Europe.